I have been speaking saying we're going to have this concept paper coming for years, and it's like, where is it at, where is it at, where is it at? Well, finally it got published. Started this back in 2010, and that's why if you look at the Federal Registers, it's 2010, so that's when it was actually submitted, and it did take quite a bit of time to work its way through the process and through. So my presentation today is going to be kind of an overview of the paper that is publicly available for people to comment on. I'm going to give you a background on why we're asking for these changes, some of the concerns that we brought up with industry, and our changes where we are today, because things have changed since the 1970s when a lot of these regulations were written, 70s and 80s and 90s, and when we implemented the program. I'm going to kind of give a brief overview of the actual concept paper itself, go through some of our current thinking, and this is just our current thinking. There is the opportunity for all stakeholders, states, veterinarians, to input. Provide your comments on what you see as the best program to move forward with. Go over a little bit of the next steps and allow the opportunity for discussion. And I did bring plenty of business cards and everything. If you want to have some time to talk about it after the meeting, I'd appreciate that and welcome those comments. The eradication program for swine brucellosis, pseudorabies. Industry has done a successful job of eliminating disease. We know how to handle pseudorabies in our commercial herds. We know how to handle swine brucellosis. We've eliminated them from our commercial herds. We are now years past, and yet our regulations are still the same. Our program standards are still the same. And we can't update our program standards without modifying our CFR. That's what we've been told. So our programs will continue to be the same unless we modify our CFR or change our programs. So we need to look at how do we move forward in a post-eradication era? Where do we go? What is the best thing for the commercial industry as a whole? And yet we still have these risk factors. We still have risks. Now there's risks and there's perceived risks, and we heard this morning and when we talked about some various risks, but feral swine reservoir are a risk. 14% of feral swine nationally are positive for pseudorabies. About 6 to 7% of the feral swine that we test through Wildlife Services are positive for swine brucellosis. So they are a risk. So we, from the USDA standpoint, we are perceiving feral swine as a potential risk. And they need to be considered that risk. So how do we account for that when our regulations are set back in the 1980s and 70s, 90s, where that wasn't necessarily a perceived risk back then? Our movement protocols were developed back in the 80s and 90s that are in the current CFR, yet our movement dynamics have totally changed since that time. And so we need to be able to account for that, because currently, today, the way that the program standards, most swine that are moving interstate with unknown exposure are considered free for movement. We have free status. So how do we account for those unknown status swine, those potential risks? How do we make sure that everything moving in interstate transit is of low risk for disease? Because our goal is to protect industry, protect you guys, protect states, because we don't want these coming back. So our current regulations, I mean, I'm talking a lot about our current regulations and why we're asking for these changes, but they are very inflexible. They're very prescriptive. There are regulations describing how much you can pay for a swine brucellosis infected sow. Doesn't matter what the market price is. Doesn't matter what that sow is worth. It says in the CFR we're only allowed to pay $65 for a sow. Doesn't matter. They're difficult to change. We all know, and everybody's talked from Dr. Clifford from Veterinary Services, that it takes a long time. It can take years depending on where they sit on the priority chart, or it can go rather quickly if there's more priority behind it. But it takes a long time to get a regulation change through. So we're looking for flexibility. How do we solve that problem? There's inconsistencies within the CFR. We have our swine brucellosis regulations are different than our pseudorabies regulations. The swine brucellosis regulations talks about feral swine. That was never incorporated into the pseudorabies regulations. So if you capture feral swine, want to turn it into a domestic swine, that is possible under the swine brucellosis regulations, but you don't have to test it for pseudorabies because it was never incorporated into those regulations. The indemnification process between brucellosis and pseudorabies is different. How do we merge these together to make a consistent program? Because we're dealing with swine. And then our terminology was never incorporated into many of the CFRs. The terminology we use for pseudorabies as commercial swine was not incorporated in the CFR. So there's varying differences on how we got to where we are, what terms do we use. We need some consistency between all of our programs. So our traditional regulations are disease-based programs. We have the TB program. We have the cattle brucellosis program. They're stovepiped. And so we're looking at it from more of a holistic species view. How do we get, looking at it by the species? Our traditional regulations are very prescriptive. $65 for a sow. You may move if you test this. It's very prescriptive. And so they actually describe what we should do for surveillance. So it makes difficulties for surveillance. They're hard to amend. And they don't take advantage of the program similarities, you know. There are similarities between movement of swine for our program diseases. And wouldn't it be beneficial to help industry, to help state veterinarians, if we can create a program that takes advantages of all those similarities in one program, so you don't have to look at one section of the CFR versus flipping through 5, 6 different sections to find the answer you need. And so we're trying to take these problems and make the change. So that's what this concept paper is addressing, is those changes. You know, we want more of a performance-based outcome. Instead of describing how to do something, describe the result, what you're looking for. Focus on that result and look at that result as what you're basing things on. Combine those disease regulations to make it simpler for industry. Make it simpler for the states. Try to put a lot of these fine details in a program type document, just like our pseudorabies program standards or our swine brucellosis UMNR. It'd be the same, but it would have the CFR to back them. So by writing the rule in a way we can still have these changes that we need, but the CFR, it'd be backed by the CFR. So we would still have our program standards, if that's what it shall be called, but it'd be backed by the CFR. And so an example of that would be, say, the administrator describes doing this procedure as written in the program standards. So that would be in the CFR. It follows many of our TB programs or swine our movement into a flexibility-based programs is where we're trying to move to. We want to make sure that we can make amendments easily and efficiently without going through the entire rule writing process, and we want to keep stakeholders involved. We eradicated pseudorabies and swine brucellosis because of your guys' support. Your guys' support allowed that. We worked directly with stakeholders. We had that involvement through the rulemaking. And yet we need to keep it there in order to make it successful. And so that gets us to our concept paper. The new approach for managing swine brucellosis and pseudorabies. And it's our current thinking. It's a current action plan. And it's open for discussion. It was published in the Federal Register back in February. It did close, but it's reopened right now, and it's open. We're taking comments again through July 7th, so we can capture all the stakeholders' concerns, because we want your opinions. And so I look forward to seeing comments for everybody in the Federal Register, so we can take that and move forward and decide where to go and how do we incorporate this program. So what does this concept paper do? It combines our pseudorabies and swine brucellosis program, so we don't have multiple sections in the CFR to look up for movement of swine. It creates that performance-based program versus having a disease and prescriptive program. It does change the state classification. Instead of having a stage 1 for pseudorabies, 2, 3, 4, 5, where 5 is free, it looks more on the performance. How do states implement their plans? And it streamlines and allows us to create a national surveillance program so we can move into comprehensive surveillance and allow that without having the CFR binding us and saying what surveillance is, like we do with swine brucellosis. It allows all states allows us to codify that we can follow a national comprehensive surveillance plan. So it has a lot of benefits there behind there. So how does it do that? We heard Brett talk about individual plans at the state fair. We heard Paul talk about Wisconsin, how they're looking at the risk of PRRS. And so this does that by working with industries to develop these swine health plans. So states and tribes, you guys can look at your own individual risk, work with your industry, your pork board, your stakeholders, and develop a plan. Now, we would provide a template, just like we provide a template now in the pseudorabies program, the feral swine template, and the template to fill out for your annual program reports. That contains that description of industry, the things we're looking for. So we have that standard template. You can work with your industry. You can submit that information in that contains those potential sources that affect you. Because I can't identify all the risk if we make a from the federal side, I can't sit and identify all the individual risk in every different state because they're different. And so work with your industry. It allows you to have that process to be more flexible working with those industries. It allows us to have more surveillance and record keeping as a requirement, and control measures where your states are more involved. Your industry is more involved in having those requirements and control measures on what are you going to do if you do find disease. So these swine health plans are very important, and we fully anticipate to provide a template to follow so they're consistent and standardized, but yet they're individualized to your state. And with that, we have to have that open and transparency. By not having a prescriptive regulation, all 50 states still need to know, if swine moving in, that those other states are still meeting and accomplishing what they say they're going to do. Other states might be curious on, are those swine of low risk coming into my state? So we need to have that open, transparent process where these swine health plans would be open for public opinion for public comment through the Federal Register process. Very similar to the PRV control board that we had, only this is opening up to all stakeholders. So that way, and additionally, it opens it up so all states also know what other states' plans are, so they can be assured that those swine moving are of low risk. Anytime there need to be changes, we can submit that through the Federal Register process, and those states that implement those plans would receive a status. Now, states could choose not to implement a plan. That's fine. They would receive an inconsistent status, and we will talk about that later. But all states would know about that. Just like if a state loses its Stage 3-5 status now, all states would know about that. It provides a status based on their performance instead of where they are on the number of diseased herds in that state. So we have consistent, provisionally consistent, and then inconsistent. And those plans are all reviewable. So with those three stages of the tiers of what we would plan to have to call states, there would also have to be a way to rescind that status in case there's an issue involved where all states need to know. And there'd still be a public process. Just like with the PRV program standards today, if a state loses status, we send out notification. We would still do that, send out notification, let all stakeholders know immediately. We would also send out a notice through the Federal Register to inform all stakeholders in case they didn't get notification through whether state calls or on the website. So states could lose status if they're moving non-slaughter animals that are diseased. If we're actually moving diseased animals across state lines improperly. That could be one way a state could lose its status. They're not implementing their plan as they have written. If the state says we're going to do ABC, but yet they don't do it, that's a sign that we need to take corrective action and change their status. Epidemiological investigations, if we have a traceback and are not conducted appropriately as written in their plan, that could be a way a state could lose status. And yet, another way is if we ask and the stakeholders ask that we make changes to your plan, and yet those changes are denied or not gone forward or amended in their plan through that process. Those are ways that we could rescind that plan approval process. This paper also talks about surveillance and our need for surveillance. Our current CFR talks about surveillance for the Stage 5. The program standards talk about surveillance to meet Stage 5. It also talks about surveillance for swine brucellosis. But it doesn't allow us to incorporate surveillance to meet a comprehensive framework. It's actually saying where surveillance is, where it should occur, and what needs to be done. This allows us to move into a national surveillance plan where we can merge our surveillance plans and have that as our surveillance. So we can look into the future. So we can utilize streams such as our non-lab streams, our diagnostic streams. We can look at meat juice and other things as more of a comprehensive surveillance national plan. This would allow us to move forward with that in more ways, to have that regulatory backbone. It would say all states have to participate in a national plan. But yet states can when they write their swine health plans, may feel that the national plan is not sufficient enough to address their individual risk. So those states can do additional surveillance on top of that and report those results to us, and we submit a yearly report. States don't have to submit their swine health plans every year. So once they do it once, if it meets the Federal Register requirements and no public comments are received back on it and it's approved, they don't have to submit that annually to us. So it reduces the state's burden. And yet, states also don't have to report. We'll do the national reporting on our national surveillance side. States would just have to report that additional surveillance they do, so that reporting burden is lessened for those state veterinarians. So I'm trying to reduce some of that paperwork going on at the state veterinarian's office, and yet help the industry. We still get our national reports so we can report disease surveillance. We can still report to all of our stakeholders the activities that occurred, and we have more of a national scope of what's actually occurring. The concept paper also goes into movement of swine. So how do we move swine when we have those three statuses for those states? And so the current regulations talk about many movement of swines now. Not all the current regulations are bad. There are still many applicable current regulations today. And we plan, and the concept paper talks about continuing many of those CFR requirements, including movement affected swine. How do we handle affected swine? Indemnity might not be there if we have a pseudorabies or swine brucellosis. So we need to look at ways to moving those swine. Can they move direct to slaughter? Well, there's current CFR requirements on how to move infected swine to slaughter. Exposed swine. If they're exposed to swine brucellosis and we're concerned if they haven't turned positive yet because there's been that exposure, can they move direct to slaughter? So there's provisions in the current CFR to talk about direct to slaughter, quarantine feedlots. We want to give the state's discretion on how to handle those. We feel that individual state should make that decision on whether they're going to allow those quarantine feedlots in their state or not. So we're opening it up for more state discretion, more state authority on how to handle quarantine feedlots. And then we get to the majority of our swine today, those that are not infected, not exposed. And that's where we have those swine from most states as consistent states, and they can move freely. States have a plan, it's an approved plan, they're a consistent state. Those swine can move freely without any restrictions. And it also goes into swine from provisionally consistent states. So if there's been some type of abnormality observed where they received a provisionally consistent, those swine may be subject to certain movement restrictions depending on what the abnormality or the condition that was observed that caused it to be provisionally consistent. And we also talk about in the paper that swine from inconsistent states would be subject to movement restrictions but can obtain movement eligibility. So in case a state decides not to go forward with and write a swine health plan, there still needs to be a mechanism there to allow producers to move swine freely. And that mechanism is what we have described in the paper of movement eligibility. It's not as strict as having a certified herd or a pseudorabies qualified negative herd or a swine brucellosis verified herd, validated free herd, I mean. It is a movement eligibility status where some testing has been done to meet the status and those swine can move freely. We also plan that the concept paper goes into our laboratory requirements. We want to have more flexibility in our laboratory requirements. Our current CFR defines the official test. Well, what happens if there's another official test come along in the future? What happens if we get an oral fluid test for pseudorabies? How do we implement that? How do we utilize that? Without having to go through the CFR changes, we want to allow that flexibility, allow it to move forward so we can utilize this new technology. It also streamlines the indemnity process and removes many of those inconsistencies that we have in there and combines them together. So we make a more consistent program, a more flexible program. So as my end of my presentation here approaches, what are the goals of this swine health paper? What is the goals of our current thinking today? And this is our current thinking, is we want a more flexible performance-based program. We want to combine those programs together where we have those similarities. So a state veterinarian or an accredited veterinarian knows where they are in the CFR and doesn't have to look through multiple sections to find the answer that fits them. We want to reduce that burden on the states, reduce that paperwork burden, allow more reduce the burden of having a prescriptive program that might not necessarily be applicable to their state. There's many things here that help states in their process. We want to update our regulatory program so it allows us to take us into the future, and it allows states to address their own unique risks, just because every state is different. And I can't write a plan for every individual state, because every state is different, and every state's industry is different. And this hopefully gets us around, allows us to address those risks, so we have assurance. There's nothing in life that's 100% other than death and taxes, but it gives us assurance that animals in interstate are fairly low risk of disease, just like they are today. It creates that national surveillance plan for us to move forward with, so we can have comprehensive surveillance that's codified and allowed by the CFR, and it also helps us define that commercial terminology and more other definitions in the CFR. So the comment paper is open for public comment through July 7th to give stakeholders time and input to work on this. It is open in the Federal Register right now, and we're gathering input prior to how to move forward with this. We're also planning on other public stakeholder discussions and welcome comments on those.